The costs to holding the resentment are in your health, your physical health, your mental health, your emotional health, your ability to have intimacy, and even maybe ultimately your healing. The gift of forgiveness is that you can clear a lot of the stuff that just doesn't need to be between you and other people. Forgiveness is like a superpower.
Welcome, welcome. We have our next Members Soul Space coming up on June 25th. And we have a very exciting members event, which we explain more about in this conversation coming up in July. We are hosting an All That We Are Forgiveness Field with Barbara Hunt on the collective issues that we are all facing, from the pollution to the rising living costs to the destructive politics to climate. After talking to Barbara, I am really excited about the power of us coming together as a global community to do this forgiveness work together and what might unfold from there in each of our lives and the activism work that we do, as well as collectively in the trajectory of our beautiful future. This takes place on July 26th and it will be online, and you can find the link to sign up for this event in the show notes. It's going to take place, sorry for those that are more on the East and Australasia areas of the world, but it will be 8 p.m. UK time. And so it will be at midday Pacific time and 5 p.m. Eastern. For me, that is the power of this community and what makes this really not just a podcast, that we can come together and create change both within and in the world that we live in, and not just share ideas, but share action and healing and create beautiful changes as we understand this time that we live in together. You can find out more about this event and our membership over on allthatweare.org. You will be able to buy tickets just for the event. The invitation is really to become a member if you're not already, and then take this invitation to come into this space of embodiment and learning and community with us. Our guest this week is Barbara J. Hunt, a forgiveness specialist, speaker, workshop leader, and best-selling author of Forgiveness Made Easy. She has over 30 years' experience in personal and spiritual development as a mentor, coach, and group facilitator. She leads online forgiveness field workshops and courses on mental and emotional well-being. She works in private practice internationally and on bespoke retreats in rural Somerset in the UK. Barbara is also an integral musician and singer-songwriter who has recorded several CD albums and singles, including her song for international peace. Her newest album and her next book are due to be released later this year. The first song you hear before the conversation gives you a little preview of this new album. This song is called Wake Up as One, and the song that you hear played out at the end is called Amazing Grace, and Barbara tells you more about these later in the conversation. In this episode called Melodies of Freedom, we explore the themes of forgiveness, restorative justice, and healthy boundaries as we speak to the question, how can we understand our inner world as a place of forgiveness and creativity designed to shape a thriving future? We hope that this conversation inspires you to release those who you are holding resentment or shame with and see this work as part of our collective healing. Welcome to All That We Are, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between activism, the sacred, creativity, and regeneration, the spaces where our inner and outer worlds dance. From healing trauma to nature connection, to new technologies to ancient wisdom, it's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a more beautiful future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community, or the pressures we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to listen, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing and envisioning, we create the futures of our wildest dreams. and we begin to embody all that we are becoming, and all that is possible.
I hear the voice deep in my heart, even though wild storms are raging and tear us apart, and the whole world's on fire. I'm watching it burn, but it feels like I'm drowning. When we gonna wake up as one? When we gonna wake up as one? It's okay to feel crazy, it's human to cry, to feel so confused and not understand why. How do we wake up from us versus them to all of us, all of us? How we gonna wake up as one? How we gonna wake up as one? Get everyone around the table, bringing our gifts to the feast, serving the whole of creation, this garden of peace. Come on, let's wake up as one. Come on, let's wake up as one. Come with your longing, your vision, your dreams. Come without knowing what any of it means. Come with your enemies, kiss on your lips. Come dressed for dancing. Come on, let's wake up as one. Come on, let's wake up as one. Come on, let's wake up. Come on, let's grow up. Come on, let's clean up. Come on, let's show up. Come on then. Come on then.
Barbara, it is an absolute delight to welcome you to All That We Are. Thank you for being here.
Totally my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
And it's really gorgeous to, as we've shared the weave together and many, many beautiful moments since then here in Somerset. It's really lovely to be able to share the beautiful work that you're bringing with this global community. And so I would love for you to tell us, what are the futures of your wildest dreams?
I did think about this a lot after the invitation, and there's lots of pieces to it. And some of it is to do with the work that I do, and some of it is more general. The futures, most of what I see is us becoming more aware of our true potential as human beings. Often when we talk about our human nature, we talk about the things that we are embarrassed about or want to explain or excuse, as opposed to our human nature, which is so compassionate and creative and has this extraordinary essence, whatever it is that creates all of life, that we're part of that. And so the futures that I see that's possible is us coming to more of a consciousness about how we really are interrelated to everything, to all of life. And that involves us doing our healing work in whatever way that we choose to do that, but also having a sense of care and nurturing everything. So the practical way of those things would be if we were able to each have support to do whatever healing work we need to do to relieve ourselves of our trauma and our whatever the inheritances that we have had and we've brought through. So to be conscious about letting those things go, to do our forgiveness work, which hopefully we'll talk more about. So changing the quality of the relationships that we have so that we are more able to stay present and make room for people's differences. And then this mind, body, spirit, this sense of the whole being needs care. And so taking care of our food, taking care of our bodies, our exercises, our exercise, our relationships, but just it's almost like a conscious way of engaging with those things rather than they just happen if we're lucky or if we come across kind of alternative options. Having our education to be about how do we help the thriving of all life in perpetuity. I mean, that would be sort of the ultimate aim. And there's something wonderful about the creativity that we have as human beings when we collaborate. How could we use our incredible creativity and vision to create a world that works for everyone? Because if you think about the really sort of biggest picture is we've created a world because people do things. So people are doing stuff, so we could do other stuff. We could do different things. And if we had different values that were driving that, so it wasn't profit, it was well-being or nurturing or taking care of all of life, the thriving of all life, we will be living in a completely different world. That's the sort of the ultimate vision would be us having that as a reality and not just as a vision.
Let's dive into forgiveness, because this is what you have dedicated so much of your life to. And I feel like it's really important because in the healing world, for people that do spend a lot of time focusing on healing, there is like a stage of it that's really around like uncovering your trauma. So you spend at the beginning, at that first moment when you realize that there are things that trigger you, when you realize like, oh, there's something else going on that causes me to behave in a certain way. And then you start to understand about trauma and the things that happened to you, the things that you experienced, how you responded to what you were given. One of the things that can happen during that process is that you almost become more alienated from your family, from the people around you, from the people that actually you love and that love you, because you start to see like these things that they did wrong, or these things that hurt you, or these things that have meant that you now behave in a certain way. Because we live in this very individualized society and in this way where we then kind of have to, it all becomes very personal and very and very like, my story. And of course, we know that we're part of such a huge, huge matrix of so many different points of why something might have happened the way that it happened. And there's so much conditioning that everyone, including our parents, have been part of, and cultural, societal, whatever is happening in those times, whatever wars or different disasters or tragedies on a collective scale that might be unfolding. There's so much that affects why we might behave in a certain way. This piece about forgiveness is, it's really hard, and it's also incredibly liberating, and it allows us to really show up in a completely different way when we've gone beyond that point of sort of uncovering the trauma into healing it, but then also to then still being able to be soft and open and boundaried. And we'll come on to boundaries later, because that's going to be a whole other piece. And so I would love for you to share with us why forgiveness became such an important part of the way in which you wanted to support other people. And then we'll get into kind of how we do actually forgive.
Well, it's interesting because I don't have a big forgiveness story, like a really terrible, tragic, difficult thing happened and then I managed to forgive it. And there are lots of those stories available, and they can be very inspiring. But in some ways, I think they can also be disempowering, because we can make comparisons between a big story and then, what happened to us, which might not be such a big deal. We think, well, why am I finding it so hard to forgive something, an ex or a relative, or, so we make comparisons. So my story about forgiveness is I was in a training, a personal spiritual development weekend training about more than 30 years ago now. And they invited us to write down the names of the people that we resented. And so I lowered my bar and I thought, well, probably pretty much everyone I've ever met in one way or another. And so I started writing my list, and then I got to number 36 and I thought, oh yeah, I probably resent my mum as well. And the significance of that was because my mum had multiple sclerosis and I was resenting the illness and the impact that had on our family. That was sort of like an opening for me for admitting where we hold resentments, where we might not think we do. Some of my work since then really has been about inviting us to be really honest about how resentful we are. And a friend of mine, she read my book and she said, I didn't realize how much I enjoyed my resentments. And so there's the shadow side of the forgiveness story, which is we have to admit that we actually do judge each other. We hold grudges, we hold gripes, we hold grievances, and we don't want to let them go. So if you're on a spiritual personal development path, sometimes you don't even want to admit that you resent anyone in the first place. So some of it is deep shadow work. So like you were saying, you have to make recognition about the things that happened as a child, the way that you were, programmed, if you like, and the conditioning that you had. And there is an undoing of that. And that involves sometimes grieving. So you have to grieve the things that you didn't have. And sometimes our resentments are about what we didn't get as much as things that we did. But before we go any further on forgiveness, I do want to just say and state the definition that I use, because it's really important. This came from my original teacher, K. Bradford Brown, who created the More to Life organization. And he says forgiveness is the absolute refusal to hold ill will against someone for what they did or didn't do. And I'll say it again just because it's long. The forgiveness is the absolute refusal to hold ill will against someone for what they did or didn't do. And ill will can be grudge, gripe, grievance, whatever it is. But it's the refusal to hold that we're usually not aware of. We think we only forgive people if they apologize or if they do the right thing, or, there has to be something that happens, as opposed to we are the ones who are in charge of whether or not we hold that grievance in our hearts or not. What I got really interested in was two things about forgiveness. One was the potential, which is absolutely phenomenal, because if you think about if everybody did, like went into a forgiveness lockdown for a couple of weeks, did all the forgiveness work that they needed to, again, we would come out into a completely different world. So, where are the dynamics that hold the hate in the heart? And if it's possible to work your way through it, which I believe it is, then you have to ask, so why do we hold on to our resentments? Why won't we forgive? And that was my other fascination. So the potential, but also, why do we find it so hard? What is it about the letting go of those grievances inside of us that seems so difficult? And so that's really been my work. And so the book that I wrote is about getting over the 5 obstacles to forgiveness, like what's in the way and how can we get over them?
And so what is in the way?
Everything's in the way. There's a few things because I did 5 obstacles in my book, but actually there are kind of like 2 pre-obstacles, which we sort of talked about. One is admitting that you're holding it in the first place. You have to say, yeah, actually, I'm, pissed off about that, or, I'm in my practice. So I'm really interested in having, so just like you might have a yoga practice or a breath practice or meditation practice, I have a forgiveness practice. That's sort of my invitation, is to have forgiveness be part of our personal spiritual development conversation. So everyone has, we're mindfulness and meditation and movement and forgiveness. Forgiveness needs to be in there, as one of the practices that we just say, yeah, that's what I do. So, in the back of your journal or whatever, you just keep a list of the people who you need to forgive. And then you just take your time, and you don't have to, with the big things, it's better if you work with a therapist, but you can do a lot of the stuff by yourself. It's not a big deal. go for a walk, do it out loud, sit down, make a little sacred space, do your practice. It's not a big deal. And I also host online forgiveness fields where people can come and do their practice together. So I facilitate, like a group. People can go through the practice all together with their microphones off so no one's overheard. And it's actually a really good way of doing group forgiveness work.
Because you get to tap into that collective field and be guided, and then that amplifies the power, but also a really nice private experience.
Exactly. It works really well. And in fact, one of the reasons I called it the forgiveness field was from Charles Eisenstein. He said every time we forgive, it adds to the forgiveness field. But also that really beautiful Rumi quote, out beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. So that's where we go.
I remember being at a retreat some years ago, and one of the exercises was to take a look in a dungeon and who you were held captive in there. And so that's something that I definitely like to every now and then be like, who is in the dungeon at the moment? And be like, oh, okay. I'll let them out.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, there are the ones that keep popping back in.
Yeah, repeat offenders. It's true. And that does happen. But that's what's so wonderful about having a forgiveness practice, is they can come back on your list and then you just do your work again. Or, and sometimes people think that, I've forgiven somebody is a one-off event, but it's not. It's like yoga. You don't go, I've done yoga. You just keep doing the practice. And sometimes you've got your pot or, and you like got a good swill and most of it's off. And then you notice there's stuff that's, needs scraping off at the bottom of the pan, or, need a bit more attention.
It's really part of our human nature to want somebody that we feel has wronged us to recognize it, apologize, and behave differently. This is something that very rarely happens. And even if you're in a long-term relationship living with someone, you might never get those apologies, and you have to kind of make a choice of like, what can you forgive and how do you forgive and how do you keep showing up with an open heart and with love without having those conversations that feel like they could be really healing. And for me, sometimes I find it especially extraordinarily hard when it's with people that are also within the healing world, because obviously we're all kind of in this world of wanting to clear things. And then yet sometimes a conflict will occur and the egos will just clamp and, and then the conversation won't be able, like no conversation happens and people, end up not ever speaking to each other again, or all of these things. And I've noticed for me that when these things would happen, it would take me like a really long time to be okay with it. And also if I was then walking into another space where somebody that I felt had wronged me, I would be like really shaky and really uncomfortable, and it'd be a really difficult experience somewhere amongst just upsetting extraordinary numbers of people over my time, which is who knows exactly why that happens. I've kind of realized that I need to I really need to spend a lot more time forgiving, and that because then what happens is that completely like erodes my own experience of being able to actually be in full expression of myself and to be in the present, because obviously you get completely locked into the past, something that happened like 12 years ago, and those people from 12 years ago don't even exist anymore. And it's also really interesting because for me, when something happens, I really want to just get in there straight away and be like, can we talk it through? And people are often like, I need time. Then for me, I find that really challenging because I find that I change and move like so much that it's then really hard to come back to something after a huge period of time with anything very real to say about it, apart from like, I'm really sorry that happened and I love you and I didn't mean for any of us to get hurt in this situation. And there was clearly some sort of misunderstanding, which there generally is. Of course, there are things that happen which are like incredibly violent and where it's not just a misunderstanding around some communication. But even then, there's often somehow there is a misunderstanding. And my mother was a forensic psychiatrist, and she always said to me that, you know, I remember asking her as a kid, like, isn't it horrible being around all those baddies, you know, because her patients were often murderers and rapists. And I remember like her saying to me when I was 7 years old or something, like, anyone could do that. Even you could kill somebody if all of the right or like the wrong circumstances unfolded in your life. So how do we do it? How do we show up with that love and really with that recognition that it's only ourselves that we end up hurting by holding on to things?
There's a few things actually. And one is there, but for the grace of God go I. We have the capacity to do those things, which is why I never say that there's anything that's unforgivable. Because if you call an act unforgivable, then you can't really do anything about it. You've just sort of written it off and the person off, even though it might have been a mistake or a misunderstanding or a whole catalogue of, you know, we don't know people's stories enough to be able to judge that. But because forgiveness is about you holding the ill will, it is an internal thing. And a lot of the time when I talk about forgiveness, I sometimes I demonstrate it by sort of gathering lots of things from the room. The refusal to hold ill will is you actually choose to put them down. And it may be that there's one thing that you definitely need to have a conversation about, but not all of the stuff. And I think sometimes what we want is we want people to be able to sit there for us to confess the full extent of our resentment and listen as if they're interested and not get defensive. And I always say, you don't do your forgiveness work with the other person unless you are both enlightened. And then probably only then under supervised circumstances, because we find it really hard to not defend when someone is saying something, you know, you've done this. We find it hard to not just go into our automatic behavior. And also that's another thing that I think is really important that you're saying is when we get triggered, it's often nothing to do with the actual present circumstances and the person even. It's often an old unresolved something or other that's going on in your dungeon that you need to go and investigate. And so again, that's the beauty of having forgiveness as a practice, because it means you can be aware, oh, you know, or if someone is repeatedly triggering you, sometimes that does mean you need to get out of the relationship. But if you do your forgiveness work, you'll know whether or not you need to actually leave the relationship or whether it's just something that's getting triggered that's from further back, something else that needs to be handled. One of my good friends now only became a good friend because I did some forgiveness work, because we were both in the same area. Friends of ours were going, oh, you should get on really well. And we went to a dance class together. And I said to her at the end, oh, shall I give you, you know, would you like to share a lift next time? And she went, oh no, I like to go on my own. And I was like, oh, okay. But because I'm kind of aware of my behavior, I thought, okay, well, I can do a little bit of forgiveness work and like just clear that out of my field. And then the next time I saw her, we were in the health food shop locally, and I was in a real rush. I said, oh, can I just quickly jump in? And she went, oh, go on then. And I was like, I've just done some forgiveness work, you know, and so I did kind of cleared the field again, because she was reminding me of other relationships that I'd had. And then the next time she was really suffering from, she was pregnant at the time and had really bad morning sickness. And so I offered to do a session with her, which she accepted. And then we started doing swaps, and then she's one of my best friends. And so I feel like the gift of forgiveness is that you can clear a lot of the stuff that just doesn't need to be between you and other people. The idea of having a practice is that you just keep clearing a dungeon and then feeling differently. I mean, if you think about how great it feels just to clear out a cupboard, you know, the cupboard under the sink or something, you get everything out and you clean it and you put everything in order and you know, you feel good like that. And so we can do the same thing with our relationships, where we can clear a lot of the field, the things that the other people don't need to know. I resented my mum for wearing pop socks. She didn't need to know that. That's to do with my judgments about fashion. You know, it's like, so a lot of our resentments are about us and not about the other person. And so that's why we can do a lot just by ourselves, clearing the field, so that when you do want to have that conversation with somebody to clear something up, it's much simpler and clearer, because it's not a whole torrent of things that you want to tell them, or the ways that they're wrong. You just have like, this is something Can I give you feedback on that? Or can we have a conversation about that?
We're also at a time where we are like highly reactive. And I feel like everyone's been through a lot in the last few years in different ways. And it's and definitely kind of relearning to relate and also maybe like at a slightly different capacity from having had like the quiet time of that the pandemic brought. And one of the things for me is that most of my conflicts, and I've had really dear friendships end through text messages where like you're in this text message like conflict and you're like, oh, like everything's being taken differently, and everything that this person believes about me it just isn't where I'm coming from. And so it may be that I came across that way, but I certainly didn't intend to. But I find that now people want to do their conflicts in text messages and emails. And the ones that really, like the people that are really still in my dungeon, it's because we just never really got to like meet eye to eye and actually just see each other and then be like, oh, let's just like evaporate all of those stories that we're holding. Because that's what happens. We get into these stories and these projections and so much like, that there could have been all kinds of reasons why somebody didn't want to share a lift with you. It might just be that their car's filthy and they don't want anyone to go into their car and like nothing to do with you at all. Something will happen and we'll take it in a certain way. And then we kind of, and when we understand like forgiveness and its like wider collective impact, what could be possible if we actually lived in a way where we made the assumption that people want to connect with us, and if they are a bit dismissive in one moment, or if they didn't understand a need, that it really was just that they were occupied with something else, and that we're able to give people more benefit of the doubt. And I feel like so much of that is to do with our own insecurities and our own inability to actually believe that we're completely lovable and that there's nothing wrong with us. And from that place, of course, then you experience other people in a different way.
Yeah, it's true. And in fact, there's 3 strands of forgiveness, if you like. One is forgiving people for the things they did or didn't do. The other is wanting forgiveness from somebody else when they won't give it. That can be really painful.
That one's really hard.
And the other is self-forgiveness. And they often are plaited together. They come as one. But, what you're saying about having a cultural expectation that people are doing the best that they can with what they have at the time. We really are up against a culture that does not have that. Because I always say, if you look at the ingredients on the back of someone's packet, you go, oh, Amisha, she's made up of this. Oh, okay, she makes sense. It's kind of, you can be much more compassionate when you know someone's story, even people who you would call enemies or people who have completely different points of view from you. But culturally, we are much more biased towards maintaining conflict. And if you think about all the great works of literature, so we're going to do a forgiveness version of Romeo and Juliet. So the Montagues and Capulets, they get together and they have a mediated meeting, they do their forgiveness work, and then there's a wedding. Who's going to come to watch that? A bit boring. So we have a cultural addiction to our resentments and to maintaining the conflict. We like it. It's more interesting. What we're also up against is our cultural expectations and the things that we're fed, the movies that we're told, the stories. If you think about all the stories that have some kind of revenge in them, or that's sort of like redressing the balance, because when you think about something terrible happens, we even have a phrase for it: get even. We want to somehow balance things up. And that's I think that's natural in us. As part of my book, I did some research about our physiology, and we have an instinct for revenge because that would have helped our societies be coherent. This is not acceptable behavior, this is. But also we have the capacity for forgiveness. That is part of our human nature. But we have, the stories we tell. There are more movies about revenge and vendettas than there are about forgiveness.
Just like there are all the movies about the couple getting together, but not the movies about how the couples manage day-to-day conflict.
Basically, how they do their forgiveness work.
Yeah. What about when it's, like the really, really deep traumas? Because I feel like we're talking a little bit about the small things. And of course, when it's about rape or some kind of really like real violence or real abandonment trauma, how does one approach that?
The principles are the same. You would always do that kind of work with a therapist, with somebody who can help you go through that, to do that kind of work. One of the things that's really important about forgiveness is knowing that the payoffs that you have for holding on to the resentment, but also looking at the costs, what it costs you to hold on to your resentment. So what I mean by the payoffs for holding the resentment is things like it's easier somehow to feel resentment and to have that sense of strength, power, rather than do your forgiveness work. Because one of the things that we find unacceptable is the vulnerability. Even though something's happened in the past, when we resent, it feels like we have power. And again, K. Bradford Brown says, holding on to your resentment is like having the power of the powerless. When you can't change something that happened, it feels like you've got power. The resentment can also act like protection, like a layer of protection. So there are some very intelligent coping mechanisms, reasons why we hold the resentment rather than forgive it, because it feels like we've got something, we've got protection, or we've got power, or we have the moral high ground, or sometimes it can be other things that are a bit more egoic, like using it as a martyr story or a victim story, or excusing your own behavior, like, well, you can't expect me to, get on in my life because of blah, 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 or blaming somebody else. So you're not taking responsibility for maybe your part in some cases, or if your behavior is justified because you're blaming the other person. So there's quite a lot of reasons why we might want to hold the resentment that we're not aware of. So that can be one of the really important key pieces for really choosing to let go, particularly when something really difficult has happened, like trauma. But also on the other side, we're not aware of what it costs us to hold the resentment. We think it's the thing that happened, the trauma, and not our resentment about it that costs us even our peace of mind. Because like you said, you're the one who's got the person in the dungeon that's going round and round in your system. And even the etymology of the word resent comes from sentir, the Latin to feel. So re-feel, you're re-feeling, and that never leaves your system. And you've probably heard those great quotes about resenting somebody is like taking poison and hoping the other person will die. Or my particular favorite, holding on to resentment is like setting yourself on fire and hoping the other person will be bothered by the smoke. They're not even in the field, and maybe they'll get the smoke, but it's such a long way away. But all of the stress hormones are in your body, and you're the one who's maintaining the dungeon. You're the jailer. You have to keep going down to make sure they're still in there. You're not free either. And so the costs to holding the resentment are in your health, your physical health, your mental health, your emotional health, your ability to have intimacy, and even maybe ultimately your healing. Because if you can't really let go of the resentment, you're kind of stuck with an unhealed wound. And I never insist that people do forgiveness work. And there is a kind of timing to it. If something has immediately happened, you do hear stories where people, like after a shooting in America or something, somebody's immediately able to forgive the shooter. Sometimes things like that can happen. Other times it's a longer period, and sometimes people need to go through something like restorative justice, where they have the opportunity to actually meet the offender and to be able to say how it is for them and what they lost. And, so sometimes that conversation does need to happen. But what's wonderful about being able to do forgiveness work is because you do it in the realm of your imagination, you can have those conversations with people, even if they never want to and will never sit down with you, or if they've died so they can't. It's like a way of completing things, or it just means that you can do it in your own pace. You can rant. I actually sometimes do literally take people up to a forgiveness field near where I live, and we walk around the field and they just express everything that they need to say, that they need to get off their chest out loud. And it's incredibly cathartic to be able to do that, to feel like you've said what you needed to say, even though it's not exactly the same as doing it face to face with somebody. But in your imagination, you are doing it face to face with somebody. So it's very powerful.
Yeah, I feel like what's really important in that is actually understanding like the timing and allowing yourself and other people to process pain and to actually feel what they're feeling in order to be able to get to a place where that forgiveness can happen. And sometimes, like you say, it just happens very naturally, and it's actually kind of like quite easy. And then there are some things that really just get in there and that really should not be rushed. And I don't rarely say should, but trauma and violent experiences are so complicated that they may take somebody a really long time to work through, sometimes years, and that's perfectly okay. And I feel like in the healing world, there can be this victim shaming of like, if you're holding on to something. And so I really want to bring in that nuance there, because I feel like it's so important to be able to feel and process in order to really then be able to completely forgive and to move forward. And sometimes there can be a pressure, especially when you're in the spiritual world, to rush that process, because you're not supposed to be able to hold on to anything. And sometimes it's not like that. And for me, I was sharing with Fiona Arrigo's group, the New Codes for Living, and I was saying that, often there is this, because there can be such a cultural just fear and uncomfort with pain and trauma, that if someone's feeling it's like they're being a victim and they're just stuck in this thing, and actually takes away our ability to actually just like compassionately hold someone so that they can process something and move it through. And some things, they come back, like they get triggered by world events or by a similar story in the media or meet something, and then that the feeling comes back in the body, and it's like, okay, it has to be felt again, it has to be released. And there's a really delicate journey with it of like knowing really when you're ready to truly forgive. How do you help people to see what they're ready to let go of, and where they actually really need to be more compassionate and honoring with themselves and with what they've been through?
I think it's really case by case basis. No two people are the same. We struggle with different things. Some people are really stuck on something that seems relatively insignificant or petty even. Somebody insults somebody at a wedding, as opposed to sexual violence or something that we would also call trauma. But there's no correlation between our ability to forgive and the thing that happened. And so, like you were saying, it's a healing journey. And I believe that the healing has to happen on every level. So you might need to do somatic work. You might need to do emotional work. You might need to do imaginal work, energetic work. In my experience, it doesn't necessarily matter where you start. It just, once you start, it seems like all of those parts have to come into coherence together. You can die with your resentments, of course, that's completely fine. And the insistence, I think that's why sometimes the stories about forgiveness do the similar thing that you're saying is, well, if someone can forgive the killer of their child, why can't I forgive this thing that happened to me? And so we then go into that comparison, and it is, everybody's different. Also underneath it is, you need to process whatever happens the way you need to process it, with your length of time that you need, but also knowing why you're holding the resentment, that there isn't really a benefit to you, that all what the seeming benefits are also costs. So even if we think it gives us a sense of power, it's not really power, because we have to just face the pain of something, which is why I sometimes say that forgiveness and grief are like sisters. So they come together. So when you're doing your forgiveness work, you're actually grieving what was lost or what didn't happen, or the things that you wish had gone differently, the things that you wish you'd done differently or said differently. It's really complex. And in my work, I'm looking at, why do we prefer to hold the resentment rather than forgive? And usually there are good reasons for that. And at the same time, there are detriments, there's costs to you. So ultimately, even if it takes you a while to do it, my belief is that we are better off without our resentments. We're served better. Our hearts are freer. We're not bothered by the smoke ourselves anymore. We're not even on fire. We've healed, and that has to be our ultimate aim, is to move toward that. Because the deal, if you like, the resentment deal, is actually a bum deal. It's not a good trade.
Thank you for tuning in. If you are enjoying this episode, do join our membership. For a small contribution, you can be part of our community, where we deepen the conversation and offer spaces of learning and embodiment. As a member, you are a patron supporting the making of this show, keeping the episodes full length, free and accessible for all. And you receive a number of benefits, such as monthly soul space, going deeper sessions, access to our library of workshops, and discounts on all our online and in-person experiences. Our membership is what makes us able to make this show and stay advertising free in a world that is always trying to sell us stuff we don't need. Head to allthatweare.org/membership to find out more and join today. When you and I did a session together that was really, really powerful, and I kind of came for one thing and went so deep in the experience. And I bring it up because I'm interested in this space of forgiveness on a collective level. We are all holding such complex identities, and there has been so much violence and trauma in our histories, and also still happening. Even if you're living like a fairly blessed existence, you're still being screwed over by systems of oppression and things that don't make sense, such as rising energy bills, whilst energy companies are boasting about profits. It's completely there in plain sight, like the ways in which you're not being honored in your contribution to the world. And for me, what was super interesting is I came for that session around like some sister conflict things, and then we ended up in this really deep community work. This community that I'd had a deep conflict with kind of ended up being connected to that, and then that ended up taking me to like villages in India that had been disseminated, and I was watching the British there in India, in this village of my ancestors, and we ended up with this incredible fire ceremony with people I went to school with and people from this community and British soldiers of the Raj, like all there with like my ancestors. And it was so beautiful for me because I've been living in this sort of weird bridge of ancestries and trauma and stories. And I got to really see it really clearly. And I noticed after that like I managed to let a lot go, and that I could then be back in certain situations just so much lighter, and also be a much better bridge because of being somebody that is often like the only person of color in a space or comes from a different background. Like it can get quite heavy, like what's sort of being like thrown at me that I'm like having to catch, and I'm like, ah. And it was really amazing to be able to like put some of it down, take a step back and see a deeper picture, and to be able to move forward without resentment. Of course, there's more to do for myself and for everyone and for all of these complicated stories that we live in. And I'm wondering how we can bring in forgiveness as a practice really on this much deeper global collective level. And that feels like something that we can all be doing, especially those that are part of all that we are and that are really co-creating this beautiful future. Can you share more around like what that looks like to really be able to connect into the ways that we are not being honored in our beings, and we're not honoring each other, and be able to offer something into that collective space of forgiveness, whilst also being in our power and our sovereignty and our, it's.
I think doing your own individual work, so clearing your field as much as you possibly can, I feel like not like it's maybe like a sacred duty to do our own work, because the freer we are, the more we can be of service to everything else and to what we want to co-create in the future. I don't know if you ever played a game called Stuck in the Mud when you were a girl. Do you ever play that? So we want to be the ones who are running around helping to be unstuck, to free other people. So doing our own work is a contribution, and like Zach Bush says, a contribution to the greater good, to the big field. So our forgiveness is an act of amnesty for the whole of humanity. So we need to do our own individual work. I would love to do more work with groups of people around the same thing. And like you were saying, we have very interesting cultural circumstances at the moment, and they are often what end up on my forgiveness list at the moment. It's much less personal. It's much more to do with about the global circumstances about which I feel like I have very little power. But the little power I do have, I don't want to be investing in my resentment. I want to be investing it in being part of the change, in doing what I can to help create a more beautiful world our hearts know is possible, rather than just hating the thing that currently exists. So I would love to do more forgiveness fields online with groups of people who need to do their work on the same people. I mean, that would be amazing. I would love to see what the results of that are, rather than people individually doing their work on their individual subjects. You're right that work needs to happen as well, because we're not just, individually we can do a lot, but together, the collective field, and it's our collective history that also needs to be healed and worked on.
Well, let's definitely do one with the All That We Are
Should
community.
We do it? I would love that.
And actually get to tap into these more societal issues of this time.
Yeah, because I think the really important thing is the energy use. It's like, anger, we can acknowledge that anger is sometimes can be a motivator for people to take action. It's that if there's been a boundary transgression, you need to honor that. And you need to take a stand, because forgiveness, that's why I give the definition that I do. It's never about saying things are okay or, taking the weaker position. It's about refusing to hold the ill will. You still litigate. There's still a lot of things that need to be done differently in our culture, and in the, particularly in the leadership of our culture.
Let's talk about boundaries for a minute, and this relationship between feeling wronged, which is actually, it's an important signal for us, and then still being able to contribute with the most amount of freedom and creativity. Because really being able to, that kind of feeling a push on our boundaries is a really good motivator for doing something in the world, for becoming an activist, for standing up for something. And it can be really difficult for people that are not touched by certain issues, because we do live in a very unequal world where things affect people in very different ways. And so I find that sometimes if people aren't touched by something, it's really hard for them to use their privilege in order to really try and change that thing. And likewise, if somebody has really hurt you, and you have been able to forgive them and kind of come back into that dynamic, but then it keeps happening. Yeah, they're two different questions, but really around boundaries and how one lives like with this sort of open heart and clearness, and yet doesn't lose like the fire.
Yeah. Well, one thing I say is you don't necessarily need the fire to take action. So like you don't get up and drive the kids to school because you're angry. You do it because it needs to be done and it's your joy to do it. So we can be motivated by other things, passion, commitment, vision, other things can drive our action. But also, if there are repeated transgressions of boundaries, sometimes you need to leave a relationship. If you've done your forgiveness work, you've tried to have a conversation, the other person is not taking responsibility, the behavior isn't changing, and you've asked for it to change, then sometimes you need to leave or litigate or, do whatever needs to be done.
That's why a lot of people left England at a certain point.
Yeah. So exactly, you vote with your feet. So it's not about being a wuss and letting people walk all over you, but your hate isn't helping. It's like if you think about, I think it's Maya Angelou. She says, hate, it's caused a lot of problems, but it's never solved one yet. So the kind of the argument that I often do get, doing the work that I do, is about, but you need anger, you need to have it to fight justice. It's like, we know what's right and wrong. You don't have to be angry about it. We just need to change the systems that are promoting corruption or perpetuating the things that aren't serving the majority. That's what we need to change. It just looks really hard, but being angry about it isn't going to help. Taking action, changing, disturbing the undergrowth will help.
I experience anger much less. Like, I used to experience a lot of anger. And so I experience sadness more. And, something might happen, or I might experience something that's happening in the world, see what's happening. And instead of like that kind of like anger, like I will feel sad and maybe I'll have a cry, and then I'll be like, okay, now what can I do? Or like, okay, that was really hurtful. Of course, I feel it because I'm a human. And even though I know where it was coming from, and I know it's not necessarily something that I can do anything differently to make that not happen. But then it's like being able to just like process that pain and then kind of carry on giving my attention to where my attention needs to be, because I guess that's one of the things, is that otherwise you get pulled into these, just living in these painful stories, and not in a way where you can fully achieve a lot. I mean, I think with activism, it's interesting because I definitely had a phase of being like, all the activists need to do more self-work. But I think that there is real power to those that are not doing the self-work and really happy to just put themselves on the line and like really make a change. And I guess there's space for so many different types of activism at this time.
Yeah, in fact, interestingly, the word anger, if you look at the etymology of it, there's one way of looking at it is about strangled grief. And you can really get a sense that when you tighten up your throat, it's actually often underneath anger is this sadness. And so for me, that really makes sense, that it's actually strangled grief, that we're grieving for things that we want to change and feel like we can't. And it's that, and that we all have different things that we're angry about or want to change, or we're grieving. And, like you were saying, like some people who have a position of privilege might not understand, somebody else's circumstances, but there's so many things that need to be changed. In some ways, it's like whatever feels like is calling your heart is the thing to do. And I do think the freer we are of our own egos. One of the spiritual teachers I used to listen to a lot said something about, you do your inner work not to relieve yourself of your ego, but to relieve other people of the effects of your ego, which I thought was good.
Yeah, definitely.
Doing us all a favor.
Yeah. You take people on these like journeys into their inner world, as do I, in a slightly different way. And I wondered if you could share, like, especially for those that are newer to doing inner work, like how they can kind of understand the space of the inner world and the impacts that it has on our day-to-day, but also like what's possible to do in there, the places that we can go. And yeah.
Well, what's possible is anything is possible, because it's the realm of your imagination, which is incredibly powerful. And there's scientific studies now proving that just imagining playing piano can strengthen up your muscles, or just like our athletes will practice in their heads winning over and over, because that sets the neural pathways. So there's incredible power in the imagination, but also from my experience of having worked in that realm. So I kind of go into people's imaginations with them. And it really is a virtual reality where there are no rules and you're making it all up. So you can do anything. If you want to change your past, you can. If you want to go back in time, you can. If you want to go forward in time, there's like, there are no rules other than, whatever it is that your limits are on yourself. Some people say, when I ask them to imagine somebody's higher self, or, like let them, go up like the ghosts of past, present, and future. And what do they see? And they're like, they're still angry. It's like, because it's their imagination putting that limit on. So I'm going, go higher. What will it take for them to have an epiphany? So that's what's wonderful about working in that realm. But also the effects of working in that realm are palpable, not just in people. The thing most people say after they've done this kind of work is, I feel lighter. So it's sort of weight loss for the soul or for the heart. There's something that you wouldn't have known you needed. And I think that's one of the other problems, if you like, with forgiveness, is people don't think they need it. But it's like after you've done it, you're going, wow, God, I feel really differently. Everything seems brighter. And, I even sometimes get people to look at their faces in the mirror before they leave, because their faces look like they've had a facelift, because something has literally been shifted, even though it's just in the realm of the imagination. And then the other marvelous and spooky thing that happens is that people say, oh, you'll never guess what, this is a few days later, my sister, brother, mother, whoever, rang me and said blah, 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 or she texted me and said the sweetest thing, and she never says that, and so something shifts in the other person that you've done your forgiveness work on, even though you haven't told them you've done it. But something energetically, and if you believe that we're all interconnected and that we're all part of one whole thing, which kind of takes us back to the beginning of the conversation, we are interconnected in ways that we don't even really know and understand, and definitely is not a reality to most of us. But if you think that there's invisible threads between us, if you do something about purifying or, energetically clearing a thread, it's going to change. It changes something. And that's why I think it's worth our time and energy to focus on those things.
What happens when you've done that forgiveness work and then actually you meet the other person and they're really holding on to it and it hasn't been a miraculous shift that they've received? Because that happens a lot as well.
Oh yeah, great question. And then, well, if you still want them to forgive you, and then you can notice that you're starting to hold a bit more of your resentment again because they're not being the way you want them to be, then you can just repeat your forgiveness, because we don't have any control over other people. It's one of the sort of great tragedies of life.
It really is, isn't it?
Only chess piece in the whole of life that you have any control over is yours. And so that is where you need to put your attention. In fact, there's that lovely, I think it's the alternative serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the people I cannot change, the courage to change the one I can, and the wisdom to know that it's me. Because that's all we can do. We really, I support people, but I only support the people who ask me to support them. In my younger years, I was always trying to work with people who weren't really interested, or I could see how they should change, but I stopped doing that, and that's a good thing. So I'm like people who want to do that kind of work, I'm available, but it has to be, you have no control over what another person does, but all you can do is your inner work. And that's why what's wonderful about the 3 strands that we talked about, self-forgiveness, asking for forgiveness, and offering forgiveness, you can do that work. So it may be that the other person won't hear your apology, or they won't, like you were saying, like you're texting, but no, they're not seeming to get what it is that you want to say. So in the realm of the imaginal, when you do your forgiveness work, you get to say it, and then you get the other person to respond. So there's a bit of gestalt. So you switch positions, they hear, they respond. So you feel like whatever it is has landed. And that's kind of all you can do, really. It's not perfect. Nothing's perfect.
There's really like an invitation in all of this conversation not to throw people out. And we're living at this time of duality as a war. There's a real political othering that we're experiencing, whether it's, it's brown people, it's refugees, it's migrants, it's people that are vaccinated, it's people that are not vaccinated, it's people that want your job, it's people that took your job. It's like, there's so many, it's people of that religion, it's people of this religion, it's people of that religion, but that live in that part of town, or whatever it is, that there is this warfare that is happening. That's not new. Divide and conquer is a phrase of the colonial times, because very effective. because when we're so busy fighting with each other, we don't notice what else is happening. And we also just become less because we become so embroiled in the battle that we're in, that we're not deeply connected to our true self and our creativity and our potential and the extraordinary love that runs through each of us. And so it really feels like this is one of the skills of this time. As I often say, intuition is one of the skills of this time, which allows us to go deeper into our inner worlds and into these unseen places. And forgiveness, it's less sexy.
So not sexy. I wish it were.
But it's really important, because that's the key for us not getting sucked in. And it feels like there's so many, you know, whether it's the media, whether it's our politics, whether it's the prejudices that may have come through our families that we've inherited, which actually always come back to a colonial or a feudal like system of separating. And then also within like the healing space, there's so much around like, that person's a narcissist, get them out of your life. Or if they aren't like vibrating at the same level as you are, get rid of, you know, there's just so much othering all the time. And it's really a really deep, it's really a deep practice to be able to have a boundary and to be able to express when our boundaries have been crossed, and make really good choices with what we do with our energy and that beautiful resource that we have to offer into this co-creation of a more beautiful world. And yet also just to know that if we're being pulled into polarizing, that we're being pulled out of ourselves, and that is some of the biggest work of this time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Back to the oneness. You know, we're one humanity. You know, there's much more that we have in common with each other than we have that divides us. You know, genetically, we have more, you know, more beef with bananas than we do with each other. You know, there's more difference than, you know, like we need to recognize that we're one humanity, and how we can let go and make room for everybody, because we're all going to be different. I mean, that's one of the glorious things. You don't want all sopranos. You want the whole range of voices in your choir, and that's what we have. And if we have a vision of how can we co-create something more beautiful together, how can we make the world work for everyone, I really feel like it is a feminine embrace. How do we get everyone around the table? How do we make sure that there's enough food for everyone? How do we, you know, take care of everyone? That we need to be having that, rather than how can I just get my needs met and make sure that, you know, no one messes with me and that I'm okay. You know, we've just created almost like mistake after mistake in how we organize our families and how we live and the things that we spend our time doing. It's almost like we've gone in like the opposite direction of what actually we need as human beings. We need community, we need difference, we need variety. That's one of our human needs, as well as security and you know, protection. We need variety. That's part of our nature.
Well, diversity is what creates healthy ecosystems.
Yeah. You don't just want trees. That's the definition of an unhealthy ecosystem, is everything being one thing.
Music is also a big part of your life and your offering into the world. And so we've shared a song at the beginning, and we're sharing a song at the end of this conversation. And I wondered if you wanted to tell us a bit about these songs.
Well, the songs are an expression of my heart, and a lot to do with my spiritual life through the years. I've always tried to express that part of things, as well as moaning about love life as well. That's also been in there. But more and more, especially my new album that's coming out this year, is about my response to the current experience of life that I was having, particularly through lockdown, and and also some of the therapeutic things that happened when I worked on a retreat for 7 years, and just the desire for healing. You know, one of the songs was like literally was my way of calibrating some of the stories from one of the clients that had really very challenging, traumatic childhood. And so it was my sort of response that despite what happened to her, the beauty and the resilience of her soul was absolutely magnificent. So there was something really wonderful about being able to use music and song to transmit that. And also music it's such a unifying thing, brilliantly across all cultures. There's some kind of form of musical expression, and our voices, it's like a magical thing. So and as a way of expressing deep things, often we have like big conversations about things, and then somebody, I use quotes all the time, I love using quotes, but a poem or a song will sum things up in a really elegant way. I think I'm as passionate about music and sound as I am, and also about silence. I think that's something else, a bit like talking about things that are not sexy. Silence is something that we find really hard and difficult and awkward, but actually it's such a gorgeous thing. If, being in silence in groups of people, there's a power and an energy that most people don't experience because they don't have those circumstances. But it's just, I don't know what there is that's possible for us to create together out of silence, or even creating silence before music comes in and then the silence after the music. There's something about the play of those two things that I'd love to explore a bit more.
And can you tell us about the two songs that we're hearing in this conversation?
Yeah, so the first one, Wake Up As One, will be on my new album. So you've got an unmixed version, but it's due out later this year.
Preview.
Yeah, preview. And it really was this longing for, like, when are we going to wake up as one? Because I think that is the only thing that's going to make the difference. It's like fixing any of the other things, politics, climate, environment, education. Unless we do the whole thing, unless we do it as one, we're going to miss something. It's a bit like trying to get all the lids down on the Tupperware, all the edges, whole thing. So Wake Up As One was really coming out of this desire for us to wake up, as one humanity. Simple as that. And my response to the challenges, because it says, about it's okay to feel crazy. It's human to cry. It's like we're having a really challenging time as a humanity. We're in an existential crisis. So there's a song for an existential crisis.
Well, we need songs for this existential crisis because it definitely does feel a lot at times. And I feel like that's why coming back to this work of forgiveness, but also community spaces that allow us to share that we're going through something very similar, even though it looks different in each of our lives. And also that it's okay to not be perfect, and it's okay to feel pain and anger and sadness and all of those things. And in fact, that's the only way that we can get to that place of freedom. And I feel like there's a lot of things that have happened, that happen, extraordinary things that seem to happen in my life that, sometimes it's just like phoning a friend and being like, oh, this just happened. And it's just like, it's almost like you're living in some ridiculous movie of like, how can more ridiculously out there, extreme, strange things just be constantly happening? But I know that it's the ability to feel them, the ability to share when it's happening, to having good people around that can hold that space without judgment and without then making a lifelong like assertion of who I am from sharing something, that then I actually get to really like shake it off and come into these like really beautiful, like deep, light, creative, inspired states. And so just our willingness to hold each other through this time is such an important thing. And really, it's why I do this, because it allows me to meet the others that are also willing to spend time in these fields together.
Yeah. And we need each other. I mean, even though there is such a striving for independence and, individuality, I mean, I can't do my own plumbing. I need electricity. You know, it's like we really are codependent.
You could do your own plumbing, but then you wouldn't finish your album.
Exactly. We need what everyone has to offer.
Absolutely. And so the song that we're hearing at the end of this conversation,
I would really like to share Amazing Grace. It's not the traditional version. It has some of the stolen lyrics from the traditional version. But again, it's a response to life. And it came out from a really dark place in my life where I was really in a dark night of the soul. Like, what's the point? You know, like, I can't change the things I want to change. And I've made mistakes. And then, because I happen to be very privileged to live somewhere very beautiful, I was walking in nature and just had this realization that even if there's no meaning, even if it's like you can't kind of make sense of it, it's still absolutely awesome. And so we're part of this amazing mystery of life. And so that was really where that song came from.
beautiful. I really felt that in my body when you said that. What is the call to action that you want to leave our friends listening with? And you can have an inner one as well as an outer one.
To engage with forgiveness as a practice. You know, anybody who's on a personal spiritual development path, you don't have to have a spiritual path. It is, I think that forgiveness is actually one of the most challenging spiritual practices. But if that isn't your thing, and you want to call it a secular ethics practice, then it's still a really, really wonderful practice, because it sensitizes you to noticing when am I getting triggered? And it is to do with your meaning making. We didn't really go into that very much, but it's like the meaning that we give the things that happen to us always come through our filter of understanding, and isn't necessarily what the other person meant, or, you know, the difference between what I say and what somebody else hears is, you know, there's often a gap. So having forgiveness as a practice, so just being sensitive to what do I need to forgive, starting a list. I do this when I do the online forgiveness fields. I get people to write down the names of the people that they want to forgive, and then how long they've held the resentment. And if you've got 36 people on your list, that's quite a few, usually 100 years. And in a group, the last group I did, we had over 3,000 years of resentment. And that was in just a small group of like 20 people. So if you think about the amount of forgiveness that there needs to be done, I invite people to start theirs. Yeah, and have that as a practice. I mean, I do feel like forgiveness is one of several practices. Meditate, manage your mind, feel, forgive, be grateful. That will be my next book. But it's part of a sort of like a suite of practices. But it's the one, like you said, not sexy, but it's probably the one that's probably one of the most powerful. So I think forgiveness is like a superpower that we don't use, and we can. So that's my invitation.
Yeah, absolutely. And is there an organization or a charity or something else that you would like to invite people to support?
Yes, I'd love to, actually. Loving Humanity, and they support girls and women in either in dire poverty or in refugee camps in Jordan and in lots of different places around the world. And so primarily either with education, sometimes they have factories that make period pads, or other ways. So that it's a wonderful organization called Loving Humanity.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank
it's been
you.
such a joy to spend this time with you. How would you like people to contact you? I know you've got a few websites.
Yes. So if they go on Linktree, then that also takes them to, like, either they can go to my website or to buy the book or to come to a forgiveness field or book a session with me if they want to work one-to-one.
Wonderful. And your websites is barbarajhunt.com?
Yes, that's the music site. And my forgivenessmadeeasy.co.uk is my forgiveness site.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You long for love and you yearn for peace, but you only get what you believe. There's nothing more to understand. You're just captive of this wonderland. So you wonder why, and you question deep, and you search beyond the shores of sleep, and knowing you will never know we are part of this amazing grace. The beauty here dazzles me, and the cruelty here bewilders me, though I see myself in all I see, in misery and ecstasy. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, like me. I once was lost, but now I'm sound. Was mine, but now I'm free. And the wind, the rain, and the burning sun are just passing thoughts of the Holy One, and nothing lasts. It all decays, and all that lives will pass away. Maybe there's a meaning, maybe, but the way it is, the way it is, the way it is, the way it is, the way it is. Here we stand, here we are, part of this amazing grace. Here we stand, here we are, in awe of this amazing grace.
Thank you for listening. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and it has sparked some inspiration and creativity in you. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on allthatweare.org. We give space to our guests to share their perspective without debating it or fact-checking, as this approach allows for deep, unedited conversations from the heart. We trust your discernment and wisdom to take what is useful and challenge what isn't in your own understanding. We offer spaces for discussion and integration in our membership community, which we would love for you to join. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible by you, our beautiful community. If you loved this and would like to connect more deeply with us, please join our membership. You choose what you contribute based on our sliding scale, and you become a patron whose support makes this podcast happen, as well as receiving access to a library of many resources and invitations to nourishing events. Please also hit subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen so others can find us. This podcast is made by an all-female global team. Me, Amisha Gadiali, producer and host, Anna Greta Folderbach, who crafts the words that accompany each episode, and Mary Chan, who edits the sound so skillfully. All That We Are celebrates all that we are already and the untapped potential that lives inside us. It invites the full power of the more than human world, nature, the unseen, our ancestors, and our future generations. It reminds us that we never exist in silo, through borders, timelines, or polarity, that in each and every moment, all that we are is here.